The rain fell in heavy sheets, beating hard against the windshield of Elliot Donovan's shiny black car. He stopped at a red light, his tired hands resting on the steering wheel. It was the end of a long day at his real estate agency, the kind of day that made him question whether the effort was worth it. All he wanted was to get to the silence of his apartment, where the solitude seemed less cruel than the chaos of the wet streets of Los Angeles. He rubbed his eyes, trying to chase away the tiredness, when something in the corner of his vision made him frown. In the crosswalk, in the pouring rain, stood a little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Her small frame was shivering, completely soaked, her hair plastered to her face. In her arms, she held a baby, a boy, Elliot guessed maybe about a year old. The girl's face was wet, but it wasn't just from the rain. She was crying, quietly, as if she knew no one was paying attention. Elliot blinked, wondering if his tired mind was playing tricks on him. But when he looked again, she was still there, small and fragile and lost. The light turned green. The cars around him began to move, but Elliot remained still. A horn honked behind him, but he barely heard it. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He rolled down the window, allowing the cold rain to pelt him, and called out, "Hey, are you okay? Where's your family?" The little girl looked up at him in surprise, her big blue eyes filled with something Elliot couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. She took a step back, clutching the baby to her chest as if the world were about to fall apart. Elliot wasn't the kind of man to get involved. Never had been. He'd learned early on that it was safer to just look out for himself. But there was something in that little girl's eyes that unnerved him. Something that pulled him out of the cocoon of self-preservation he'd built over the years. "You're going to catch a cold out here," he said, softening his voice so as not to scare her. "Please, where's your family?" She hesitated and then, with timid steps, approached the car. With each step, her soaked boots splashed water from the puddles. When she got close enough for Elliot to see better, he realized how badly she was shaking, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something that felt broken. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Elliot asked, trying to sound calm, even though his mind was racing. The girl shook her head, her lips trembling before she murmured, "I don't know where my mother is." The answer hit Elliot like a punch to the gut. The lump in his throat tightened. He didn't have children, never wanted any, but the way that little girl was standing there, so alone, brought up something he thought he'd buried long ago. "It's okay." He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. "Get in the car. I'll take you somewhere safe." She hesitated, but it seemed she had no other choice. Carefully, she opened the back door and climbed in, holding the baby tightly as if he were the last thing keeping her upright. Elliot glanced at her in the rearview mirror as he started to drive. The muffled sound of rain filled the car, but the silence between them was even more deafening. He didn't know who these children were, where they came from, or what would happen next. But something inside him told him that his life and theirs would never be the same again. Elliot drove slowly, the city lights reflecting off the wet streets, as his mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. He glanced in the rearview mirror every now and then, watching the little girl. She was quiet, holding the baby tightly to her chest, as if she were afraid he would be ripped away from her at any moment. Her eyes, big and blue, stared out the window, but didn't seem to see anything. He cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. "What's your name?" The girl glanced at him in the mirror for a brief moment before answering softly, "Chloe." "And his?" Elliot gestured toward the baby with a slight nod. "Max." Elliot took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the responsibility he had just taken on. He knew nothing about children, much less how to handle a situation like this. But there was something about the way Chloe held Max, the strength she displayed despite her obvious vulnerability, that made him want to protect them. "Where's your mom, Chloe?" he asked, trying to sound calm, even though his heart was pounding. Chloe held Max a little tighter against her, biting her lip before answering. "She left. Said she'd be back soon, but it's been a few days." Elliot felt a tightness in his chest. Days. This kid had been taking care of a baby alone in the rain for days. He clenched his hands around the steering wheel, trying to contain the anger that was starting to bubble up. Not at Chloe, but at him. But in this situation, who would leave a child alone like this? "Do you have somewhere else to go? A relative, a friend of your mother's?" Chloe shook her head, her eyes fixed on the sleeping baby in her arms. "It's just me and Max now." Those words hit Elliot like a punch to the gut. He knew what it was like to grow up without anyone to trust. He had learned to fend for himself early on, but not without scars. And now, here was this little girl, carrying a burden no child should have to bear. He parked the car in front of his apartment building, taking a deep breath before turning to face her. "Okay, Chloe, for now, you and Max are going to stay with me. We'll figure this out in the morning, okay?" Chloe hesitated, her eyes filling with tears that she fought back. "You're not going to take us to an orphanage, are you?" Elliot felt a lump in his throat. He knew exactly what she was feeling, the fear of being discarded, of losing what little she had left. He shook his head. "No, Chloe, you two are staying together, I promise." Chloe nodded slowly, but the fear was still there, etched in her eyes. She didn't look convinced, but she was too tired to argue. Elliot got out of the car, walked around, and opened the back door to help her out. She held Max tightly as he led her into the building. The doorman nodded at him, but gave Chloe a curious look. Elliot simply waved back, indicating that this was no time for questions. When they reached the apartment, Chloe stood for a moment in the doorway, looking around with wide eyes. It was the cleanest, most beautiful place she'd probably seen in a long time. "You must be freezing," Elliot said, grabbing a towel and handing it to her. "Wrap this around yourself and Max." Chloe did as he said, covering Max first before drying herself off. Elliot watched as she worked carefully, despite how exhausted she was clearly. He went into the kitchen and grabbed what he could find, a few cookies and some milk. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. When he set the plate in front of her, Chloe looked at him with wary eyes, but said, "Thank you." Elliot just nodded, sitting quietly as she fed Max a cookie and tried to feed herself. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she looked around as if she expected something bad to happen at any moment. After a few minutes, Chloe finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to lose Max. Please don't let them tear us apart." Elliot felt a pang in his heart. He leaned forward, trying to meet her eyes. "You won't lose Max, Chloe. I promise. We'll figure this out together, okay?" She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide if she could trust him. Finally, she nodded, tears silently streaming down her cheeks. Elliot leaned back, feeling the weight of that promise. He knew he was getting into something big, something that would probably change his life. But looking at Chloe and Max, he knew he had no choice. Someone had to take care of them, and for now, that someone was him. The apartment was silent except for the muffled sound of the rain still falling outside. Elliot watched Chloe from the couch as she sat on the rug, carefully feeding Max. She was exhausted, that much was evident. Every movement felt like it weighed twice as much as it should. And yet, she maintained a determination that Elliot found impressive for someone so young. He stood up, went to the closet, and pulled out a soft blanket. "Here," he said, handing the blanket to Chloe. "Why don't you get some rest?" Chloe hesitated, looking from Max to Elliot. "I need to take care of him." "I'll take care of him for you," Elliot replied, trying to sound reliable, even though taking care of a baby was something he'd never done before. "You're tired. He needs you to be okay, okay?" She stared at Elliot for a long moment before finally nodding. Her small hands were still tightly gripping Max, but after a few moments, she carefully placed him on the couch next to Elliot and wrapped the blanket around herself. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, before closing her eyes. Elliot looked down at the sleeping baby. Max seemed peaceful now, but the image of Chloe holding him in the rain continued to haunt Elliot's mind. He wondered how many nights that little girl had spent awake, trying to protect him. Max stirred slightly, mumbling something incoherent in his sleep, and Elliot instinctively placed a hand on his back to soothe him. He had no idea what he was doing, but it seemed to work. "Okay, kiddo," he said softly. "We'll figure this out together." As the night wore on, Elliot felt his mind drift to the past. He'd been like Chloe, alone in a world that didn't seem to care. Growing up in foster homes, he'd learned early on that trusting people was dangerous. But looking at Chloe, he realized something. She hadn't given up. Despite everything, she was still fighting to keep Max safe. Time passed, and Elliot realized that Chloe had fallen asleep soundly, the worry softening from her face. He sighed, carefully standing up and scooping Max up in his arms. The weight of her small body was light, but the responsibility he carried felt overwhelming. Elliot walked to the guest room and placed Max on a makeshift pile of pillows and blankets on the floor. He adjusted the baby carefully, making sure he was comfortable before returning to get Chloe. "Hey, Chloe." He shook her gently. She woke with a start, her eyes wide and panicked for a moment, but then she saw Elliot and relaxed. "Where's Max?" "In the guest room," Elliot said. "He's fine. Let's get you there too." Chloe nodded slowly and stood up, still wrapped in the blanket. Elliot led her into the bedroom where Max was sleeping peacefully. She knelt down beside him, checking to see if he was really there, before laying down next to her brother and snuggling against him. "Good night, Chloe," Elliot said softly. "Good night," she replied, her voice muffled with sleep. Elliot turned out the lights and went back into the living room. He flopped down on the couch and let out a long sigh. Exhaustion was finally setting in, but his mind was still restless. He knew this was just the beginning. As he stared at the ceiling, one question kept running through his mind. Who were these kids really? What had happened to their mother? And how, in the name of everything he knew, had he just become their temporary guardian? For the first time in a long time, Elliot felt something strange. It wasn't just worry or exhaustion, it was a sense of purpose. He didn't know how, but he felt like somehow he was exactly where he needed to be. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the large windows of the apartment, but Elliot's sense of unease lingered. He woke early, the weight of what had happened the night before still weighing on his mind. Chloe and Max were still in the guest room, fast asleep. He walked over to the half-open door and watched them for a moment. Chloe was huddled next to Max, her arm wrapped protectively around her brother. The sight made Elliot's chest tighten. He knew he had to act. In the kitchen, as he made coffee, his mind raced with unanswered questions. Who was Isabella, the mother of these children? Why had she disappeared? And most importantly, how could he find her? When Chloe woke, her eyes were less frightened, but there was still a weight evident in her expression. Elliot placed a bowl of cereal in front of her, trying to create a welcoming atmosphere. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, thank you." His voice was soft, almost a whisper. After a few moments of silence, Elliot decided it was time to start searching for answers. "Chloe, can we talk?" She nodded slowly, but her gaze remained fixed on the bowl. "I need to know more about your mother," he began, choosing his words carefully. "What happened before you guys were out?" Chloe swallowed, her fingers tightening around the rim of the bowl. She wasn't okay. After Max was born, she was different, more tired, more sad. Her voice shook. Sometimes she'd disappear for a few hours, but she always came back. Elliot frowned, feeling a knot of worry form in his stomach. "What about this time?" Chloe shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "She said she'd be back soon, but it's been 4 days. She didn't take her phone. I tried to wait, but..." Elliot felt a mix of anger and compassion. Anger for a mother who seemed to have abandoned her children, but also compassion for a woman who was clearly struggling with something that might be bigger than herself. "Chloe, was your mother on drugs?" he asked gently, though he already suspected the answer. The girl hesitated, her eyes filled with shame, as if she were admitting something she was guilty of. "Yeah." She tried to stop, but after Max, it got worse. Elliot rubbed his face with his hands, feeling the weight of the situation increase. He knew he was dealing with something more complicated than just finding Isabella. Chloe and Max were in the middle of a chaos that no child should have to face. "It's okay, Chloe. It's not your fault." He leaned forward, trying to reassure her. "We'll find out where she is and help her, okay?" Chloe's eyes were filled with hope and fear. "Do you think she's still alive?" Elliot hesitated before answering, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know, Chloe, but I'll do my best to find her." Chloe nodded, tears streaming silently down her face. Elliot knew he couldn't fail her. He had to find Isabella, no matter how hard it was. Throughout the afternoon, Elliot started making calls. He contacted shelters, hospitals, and even the police, trying to find any leads. But it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. He didn't have much information to offer, just her name, Isabella Connors. Early that evening, just as he was starting to lose hope, a call brought in a clue. A woman by the name of Isabella Connors had been seen checking into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town a few days ago. The place wasn't exactly welcoming. It was known for him, taking in people who wanted to stay under the radar. Elliot glanced over at Chloe, who was quietly playing with Max on the living room rug. He knew he couldn't just leave without an explanation. "Chloe, I think I know where your mom is," he said. She stood up quickly, her eyes wide. "Where? A motel? I'm not sure, but I'll check. Can you stay here with Max? I'll be back as soon as I can." Chloe seemed hesitant, but finally nodded. "Please bring her back, Elliot." Elliot gave a small smile, though the uncertainty was clear in his mind. "I'll try, Chloe. I promise." In the car, as he drove toward the motel, Elliot felt the weight of responsibility grow. He knew that finding Isabella would only be the beginning. The real fight would be helping her get back on her feet and get back to her children. He just hoped it wasn't too late. The road seemed longer than it actually was as Elliot drove toward the motel. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained cloudy, as if reflecting the uneasiness in his chest. Every mile seemed to add to the weight of the situation. He knew that finding Isabella would only be the beginning, but still, the thought of not finding her terrified him. Chloe and Max had been through so much already. Finally, he had arrived. The motel was exactly as he'd imagined it. A rundown building with peeling paint and a neon sign that flickered erratically. The gravel parking lot was nearly empty except for a few old cars that looked abandoned. Elliot took a deep breath, parking near the entrance. He got out of the car, the air thick with humidity. Every step toward the building made his heart beat faster. The metal stairs creaked as he climbed to the second floor, where he'd been told room 212 was located. When he reached the door, he hesitated. The number was almost faded, hanging precariously. He raised his hand and knocked, softly at first, then louder. "Isabella?" he called, his voice firm but thick with emotion. "Isabella Connors, I'm Elliot Donovan. I'm here to help." The silence on the other end was deafening. He knocked again, his heart hammering in his chest. Finally, he decided to turn the doorknob. To his surprise, the door creaked open. The air inside was heavy, a mixture of cigarette smoke and something sour. The only light came from a flickering TV in the corner. The room was a mess. Clothes strewn about, empty bottles, and syringes strewn across the table. And then he saw her. Isabella lay on the bed, motionless. Her skin was pale, her eyes half-lidded. She looked like a ghost, a shadow of the woman Chloe had described. Her face showed not only the signs of addiction, but also a deep despair. "Isabella?" Elliot called again, moving closer. Her eyes slowly opened, but they were empty, as if she were looking right through him. Elliot knelt beside the bed, trying to get her attention. "Isabella, it's Elliot. Chloe and Max are waiting for you. We need to get you out of here." Chloe's name seemed to pierce the haze that surrounded Isabella. Her eyes focused for a brief moment, and she tried to speak, but her voice came out as a whisper. "Chloe, Max?" Tears began to stream down her face. Elliot held her hand tightly, trying to convey some strength. "They're okay, but they need you. We can't do this without you." Isabella shook her head weakly, reaching for something beside the bed. I can't. I failed them." Elliot's heart sank. He saw the guilt in her eyes, the crushing weight she carried. "You can still fix this, Isabella." His voice was firm. "Chloe wants nothing more than her mother back. That's all that matters." Her sobs grew louder, and she covered her face with her hands. "I don't deserve them, not after what I did." "They don't care about that. They just want you." Elliot took a deep breath, gripping her arm. "Fight for them. Fight with them." For a long moment, Isabella lay still, her sobs slowing. Finally, she nodded slightly, her eyes still wide, filled with fear and uncertainty. "Okay," she whispered, barely audible. Elliot helped her to her feet, her fragility evident. She felt light, almost as if the life had been drained from her. He supported her as they walked out of the room. Each step felt like a small miracle. When they reached the car, he helped her into the passenger seat, making sure she was comfortable before he climbed in and started driving back to the apartment. The silence was heavy on the way. Isabella stared out the window, tears still streaming down her face. Elliot finally broke the silence. "Chloe's waiting for you. She took care of Max all by herself. She's stronger than I thought." Isabella closed her eyes, her breath shaky. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know how to be the mother they need." "No one knows at first," Elliot replied, his voice soft but determined. "But what matters is that you're here now. Chloe and Max need you. That's all that matters." She didn't answer, but her tears continued. Elliot knew the road to recovery would be long. But in that moment, he felt something different. For the first time, it felt like there was hope. The sun was just beginning to hide behind the clouds when Elliot pulled up to the front of the building. The silence between him and Isabella had been heavy the entire drive, each lost in their own thoughts. He got out of the car, walked around, and opened the door to help her. Isabella then hesitated, her eyes filled with uncertainty before finally taking his hand. They walked into the building and rode the elevator up. Elliot noticed that Isabella's hands were shaking and she was avoiding her reflection in the mirror. "You can do this, Isabella," he said, his voice firm. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear. "What if they don't forgive me?" "Chloe and Max just want you back. They've already forgiven you." Elliot tried to project confidence, even though he knew Isabella would have to believe it on her own. By the time they reached Elliot's floor, Isabella's steps were hesitant, almost wobbly. He opened the apartment door and made room for her to enter. Inside, Chloe was sitting on the couch with Max on her lap. She looked up when she heard the door open and froze when she saw her mother's figure standing in the doorway. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Isabella stood still, her eyes fixed on Chloe. Her hands shook as she tried to take a step forward. "Chloe," she whispered, her voice breaking. Chloe carefully placed Max on the couch and stood up, her eyes wide and shining with tears. "Mom?" Her voice was a mix of hope and fear, as if she feared this was a dream that would disappear at any moment. Without warning, Chloe rushed into Isabella's arms, wrapping her in a tight hug. Isabella fell to her knees, holding her daughter tightly as tears streamed down her face. "I'm so sorry, Chloe." Isabella's voice was thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything." Chloe shook her head, tears wetting Isabella's shoulder. "I don't care, Mom. I just want you back. Please stay with us." Isabella held her tighter, sobbing. "I promise I'll never leave you again." Elliot stood in the doorway, watching the scene with a heavy heart. He knew there was a long way to go, but this moment was a small miracle. After everything Chloe and Max had been through, there was finally a glimmer of hope. Max began to stir on the couch, slowly waking up. Isabella looked at him and walked over, kneeling beside her son. "Max, my baby." Her voice broke as she reached out for him. The little boy blinked at her, confused at first, but when Isabella took him in her arms, he snuggled against her. The room seemed to fill with a calm that had been absent for so long. Elliot cleared his throat, catching Isabella's attention. "You two have a lot to talk about. I'll give you space." Isabella looked up at him, her eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you, Elliot, for everything." He shook his head, offering a tired smile. "Just take care of them. That's all that matters." That night, as Isabella, Chloe, and Max sat together, laughing quietly through their tears, Elliot stepped out into the hallway, quietly closing the door behind him. He leaned against the wall, letting out a deep breath. There were more battles ahead, recovering Isabella, rebuilding trust, fighting off the demons within. But for now, this moment was enough. Isabella's reunion with her children was just the beginning. But it was a beginning. Soft morning light illuminated Elliot's apartment, but the relief from the night before was starting to give way to reality. Elliot sat in the kitchen, watching the steam rise from his coffee cup. He knew Isabella's journey was over. It was just beginning. Chloe and Max were calmer, but there was still a lot to be done to rebuild this family. Isabella walked hesitantly into the kitchen, her eyes puffy from crying the night before. "Good morning, Elliot," she said, barely above a whisper. Elliot looked at her and offered an encouraging smile. "Good morning. How are you feeling?" Scared, Isabella sat down at the table, running her fingers through her messy hair. "I don't know where to start." Elliot took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "The first step is to admit that you need help. You already did that when you came back to them. Now, we need to plan what comes next." Isabella nodded, but her eyes were filled with doubt. "I don't know if I can do it. What if I fail again?" "You don't have to do this alone." Elliot placed a sheet of paper in front of her. "I've made some calls. This is the address of a rehab center. They have a spot for you, and it's a place that can really help." Isabella's eyes filled with tears again. "What about Chloe? What about Max? Who's going to take care of them?" "I will." Elliot's answer was firm, without hesitation. "They can stay here with me until you recover, but you have to be willing to fight, for them and for yourself." Isabella stared at the paper, her hands shaking as she held it. She knew Elliot was right, but the thought of leaving her children again felt unbearable. "I never wanted it to come to this." "No one does," Elliot said sympathetically. "But you have a chance to change that now. Not out of guilt, but out of love. Chloe believes in you. Max needs you. And I believe you can do it." Later that day, Elliot sat down with Chloe to explain the plan. He knew it would be hard for her to understand. "Chloe, your mom needs help, and this is the first step to her getting better." Chloe looked at him, her eyes full of concern. "What if she doesn't come back?" "She will." Elliot put his hand on her shoulder. "And in the meantime, you and Max will stay with me. No matter what happens, I promise I won't leave you alone." Chloe nodded slowly, still processing everything. "I just want her to be okay." "And she's starting to," Elliot said with a small smile. The next day, Elliot drove Isabella to the rehab center. The goodbyes were difficult, marked by tears and promises that she would do everything she could to come back better and stronger. Chloe hugged her mother tightly, holding her as if she was afraid to let her go. "Please come back to us, Mommy," she said, her voice breaking. "I will, sweetie. I promise." Isabella kissed the top of Chloe's head and held Max for a long moment before finally turning and walking into the center. Elliot drove Chloe and Max back to the apartment. The silence in the car was heavy, but there was an air of hope that had not been there before. He knew the next few weeks would be challenging, but he also knew that they were not alone. That night, as Elliot was making dinner, Chloe appeared in the kitchen. "Elliot?" "Yes?" "Thank you for helping us." He looked at her and smiled, feeling the weight of her words. "You are strong, Chloe. I'm just here to remind you of that." Chloe smiled shyly and went back into the living room, where Max was playing with a small toy Elliot had bought for him. As Elliot watched them, he realized that, despite everything, this little family was starting to rebuild. It was a slow process, but each day was a step towards something better. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Elliot. He found himself in a role he never imagined: temporary guardian for 2 children who had survived more than he thought possible. Chloe was starting to open up more. She no longer woke up startled every night, and Max, although small, seemed to be calmer, laughing at simple things like the sound of toys or the birds chirping outside. Elliot was in the kitchen, washing the dishes after dinner, when he heard soft footsteps. It was Chloe. She approached, carrying a drawing in her hands. "I made this for you." He dried his hands quickly and took the paper. The drawing showed 3 figures holding hands: Chloe, Max, and Elliot. In the corner stood a woman with long dark hair, Isabella. Above them were the words written in crooked letters: "Family." Elliot's chest tightened. He looked at Chloe, who looked nervous. "Do you like it?" "It's perfect," he said, his voice cracking. He knelt down and hugged her. "This means a lot to me, Chloe." "Thank you." She smiled shyly and walked back into the living room, where Max was playing on the rug. Elliot remained kneeling, holding the drawing. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had found something he never knew he was looking for. A few days later, Isabella made her first. The call came to them from the rehab center. Chloe rushed to answer, her voice more excited than Elliot had ever heard it before. "Mommy, are you okay?" The conversation was short, but full of hope. Isabella sounded clearer, more determined. She promised Chloe that she was working hard to get better and that she would be back soon. When the call ended, Chloe looked at Elliot, her eyes shining with excitement. "She'll be back. I know she will." Elliot nodded, feeling the same hope rise within him. "Yes, she will." That night, as Elliot was tidying up the kitchen after putting the kids to bed, his phone vibrated. It was a message from the rehab center. Isabella was making good progress and would start reintegration programs in a few weeks. He breathed a sigh of relief, but he knew there were still challenges ahead. Isabella was on the right track, but the healing process would be long and difficult. A short time later, Isabella finally returned. Elliot took Chloe and Max to meet her at the center. When Isabella showed up, she seemed different, healthier, more alive. Chloe ran to her, throwing herself into her arms as Max babbled happily. Isabella cried as she hugged them, promising she would never leave them again. Elliot watched from a distance, feeling a mix of joy and sadness. He had become part of this family, but he knew it was time to step back and let them rebuild together. That night, back at the apartment, Isabella thanked Elliot. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. You saved us." "You saved yourself, Isabella," Elliot said with a smile. "I just gave you a push." She nodded, overcome with emotion, and hugged him. "Thank you for believing in me." Elliot looked at Chloe and Max, who were playing on the rug. "They're the reason you're here. Don't ever forget that." As the weeks turned into months, Isabella continued her recovery. Now at home with Chloe and Max, Elliot stayed close by, visiting often and helping whenever needed. He knew he had found more than a purpose. He had found a family, even if it wasn't in the traditional way. Elliot, Isabella, Chloe, and Max still had a long way to go, but now there was something different: hope. Together, they began to build a future where the weight of the past would no longer define them.